The fluorescent lights hummed at exactly 60 Hz, a frequency most people never noticed, but Sarah Chen heard it the way a tuning fork hears its note. She'd been hearing it for 3 years, every night shift, same frequency, same hum, same invisible weight of a life erased. Cedar Creek Medical's ER smelled like antiseptic and possibility at 2:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, that particular brand of clean that only existed in hospital corridors where nobody watched you too closely if you worked in the dark. She restocked the crash cart with the precision of someone who'd once triaged shrapnel wounds outside Tikrit on a temperature of 127 degrees and a water supply that ran out at noon. The medications went into their slots in exact order: epinephrine, atropine, amiodarone, sodium bicarbonate, each vial positioned at the same angle, each label facing forward. Another nurse, Jessica, watched her do this and said nothing. Jessica had learned 3 months ago not to ask why Sarah checked doses twice. Some people had a system. Sarah had survival instinct wearing scrubs. The scar on her left forearm caught the fluorescent light as she reached for the 4 supplies. She'd told the curious residents it came from a car accident in 2019, a story so generic it discouraged follow-up questions. The truth: shrapnel from a 155mm howitzer round, treated in a field hospital with expired antibiotics and prayer, stayed in the same vault as everything else. The Pentagon had been very clear about that. Vault. Silent. Vanished. You are no longer Captain Sarah Chen of the United States Navy. You are no longer anything except what this new life requires you to be. She laid out the 4 kits with a surgical precision that made her hands look like they were operating on their own. 18-gauge catheter. 20-gauge catheter. 22-gauge for pediatrics. The tourniquet went on with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from 10,000 placements, maybe 11,000 if you counted the one she'd done on teammates with no kit at all, just a strip of cloth and steady hands, and the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. The vein would appear. The vein always appeared when you used the right tourniquet angle and applied pressure to the right point. That wasn't luck. That was physics and anatomy and muscle memory that didn't care that her official record said she'd been a civilian nurse for 8 years. The ER intake nurse, Marcus, approached with a patient chart. His eyes had a particular quality: respect without explanation, the kind of deference that usually required credentials framed on a wall. Sarah didn't have credentials framed on a wall. She had a nursing license from 2016 and a background that would appear clean to anyone running a standard check, which was the entire point of the Pentagon's work. Background checks looked at what they were supposed to look at. They didn't look at classified operations or the specific names of people who'd been ordered out of existence by people with 4 stars on their shoulders. Trauma Bay 1, Marcus said. 48-year-old male, fall from a ladder, rule out head injury. They're waiting on imaging, but vitals are all over the map. Sarah set down the 4 kit and moved. Not quickly. Quick attracted attention, questions, the kind of scrutiny that had to be avoided. She moved with the economy of someone who'd learned that efficiency was invisible when it wasn't rushed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she walked, that 60 Hz hum that most people's brains filtered out automatically. Sarah's brain never filtered it out. Constant awareness was a habit that didn't break after 14 years, even when you've been ordered to break everything else. The patient in Trauma Bay 1 was pale, sweating, his blood pressure reading 168/104 on the automated cuff. Head trauma, possible intracranial bleed. His daughter stood beside the bed with the particular frozen expression of someone watching a parent become suddenly fragile. Sarah's daughter was 8 years old and would be asleep at home with a neighbor's teenage son watching her, a detail that had to be managed with the kind of precision Sarah applied to everything else. Emma couldn't know that her mother worked nights. Emma couldn't know that her mother had spent 14 years doing things that didn't have names. Emma had to have a mother who was just a nurse, and Sarah had to be a person who could perform that role with complete fidelity. "Good morning," Sarah said to the patient, her voice pitched low and even. The kind of voice that didn't suggest urgency but carried authority anyway. "I'm going to get info started so we can get you some fluids while we're waiting for the imaging. This'll be quick." The daughter stepped back. Automatically. Without being asked. Sarah had never figured out why this happened, why people deferred to her without knowing why they were deferring, but it was consistent enough to be useful. She pulled the tourniquet tight around the patient's bicep, found the median cubital vein with her fingertip, and positioned the catheter at a 45-degree angle. The needle went in with that particular sensation that only registered when you'd done it thousands of times, the subtle give of skin, the gentle pop as the catheter threaded the vessel wall. A small amount of blood flowed into the chamber, the confirmation that she was in the right place. "There we go," she said, securing the four with tape. "You're going to feel better in just a moment." The patient's blood pressure started to respond almost immediately to her calm presence. That wasn't medical. That was psychology, the particular brand of it that came from being around people who'd learned to manage trauma under fire. When you'd held a teammate's hand while medevac helicopters circled your position, you understood something fundamental about human nervous systems that textbooks couldn't quite capture. Dr. Mercer was watching her from the trauma bay doorway. She felt his presence the way some animals feel weather changes, a shift in air pressure, a quality to the silence that suggested judgment. She didn't look at him. Looking at him would be acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was a form of engagement that could only complicate things. She continued working, adjusting the drip rate, checking the bag of normal saline, positioning the patient's head on the pillow with the kind of care that was invisible because it looked effortless. Mercer approached. His shoes clicked on the linoleum tile, expensive shoes, probably Italian leather, the kind purchased by someone who'd never had to care about whether footsteps announced his position. Sarah continued her work. "Interesting technique," Mercer said. His voice carried the particular tone of someone asking a question that wasn't actually a question. "Where did you train your four placements? I don't recall it in your file." Sarah's jaw tightened once, barely perceptible. The kind of physical response that only registered if you were specifically looking for it, and Mercer was specifically looking for it. She'd learned to make those tightnesses smaller and smaller over the years, until they were barely visible at all. "Community college program," she said. "Plenty of practice since then." "At a community college," Mercer repeated. He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone confident in his right to condescend. That explains the unusual techniques. The medical school programs teach a more standardized approach. Sarah finished adjusting the four and stepped back. The patient's daughter was watching, reassured by Sarah's presence in the way that didn't require explanation. Mercer was watching too, reassured by nothing, suspicious of everything that existed outside his framework of credentials and pedigree. There was a particular type of man who couldn't tolerate competence that arrived without documentation. Mercer was that type. He was the type who would, over time, begin to see her quiet precision as a threat to his own sense of order. "I'll need the imaging to come through," Sarah said to Marcus, who'd appeared with the patient's file. "Vitals every 15 minutes until the attending reviews." "Already ordered," Marcus said. "Thanks, Sarah." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the fluorescent light around him. The kind of shift that came from a man watching someone else receive gratitude without having earned it through the channels he understood. He turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum with the rhythm of someone whose footsteps always announced his importance. Sarah returned to the supply room and continued her routine. The medications went back in their organized slots. The 4 kits were restocked. The crash cart gleamed under the lights, ready for the next emergency that would come because emergencies always came in the ER, especially during night shifts when the city's worst injuries found their way to Cedar Creek Medical. She worked with the kind of methodical focus that was almost meditative, the same focus she'd used in a hospital tent outside Tikrit while mortars landed approximately 600 meters away and she'd refused to let her hands shake even once. At 4:15 a.m., she took her break. The break room was empty except for an old microwave and a refrigerator that hummed slightly off rhythm from the fluorescent lights. She sat in the plastic chair and pulled out her phone. A text from the neighbor, Tommy, 3 messages confirming that Emma was asleep, that everything was fine, that he'd lock up when he left at 6 a.m. when the morning babysitter arrived. Everything coordinated. Everything planned. Everything maintained. She opened her locker. The folded flag was in its usual place, on top of her jacket. The flag was from the funeral of Matthew Torres, Captain Matthew Torres, who'd been her medic and her friend and had died on the third day of an operation that had to be buried so completely that his name never appeared in any official records. The flag was all she had, a piece of fabric folded into a triangle, no explanation attached, no documentation of who Matthew had been or what his name meant. Sarah's hands rested on the flag for exactly 30 seconds. That was the amount of time she allowed herself, the amount of time she'd calculated as the maximum before her nervous system started to show physical signs of grief. 30 seconds, then her hands had to be steady again, her composure had to reset, and Sarah Chen, the night shift nurse, had to continue existing. When she returned to the ER at 4:45 a.m., Marcus was waiting with another chart. A new patient, a 61-year-old male with chest pain, vitals unstable, EKG pending. Sarah moved toward the bed, but Mercer was already there, already positioning himself as the authority, already explaining to the patient what he was going to do with a confidence that was absolute. Sarah stepped back. For now, that was the role that existed. The quiet nurse in the background. The one nobody watched too closely. The one whose hands moved with precision that nobody had to acknowledge. But 6 days remained before a patient would arrive who would see her hands. 6 days before a SEAL commander would arrive in the trauma bay with a cardiac event, and before Sarah's choice to save him would begin to unravel everything she'd built. For now, she had the night shift and the fluorescent lights and Emma asleep at home and a folded flag in her locker, and that was a life that could be maintained with nothing but steady hands and 30 seconds of grief at a time. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent desperation. Dr. Mercer stood by the sink, his voice pitched low enough that only the two residents clustered around the counter could hear him, but not low enough that Sarah, entering behind them with her empty mug, wouldn't catch every word. "I'm not saying she's incompetent," he said, his tone dripping with the false concern of a man building a case. "But I've noticed irregularities. Medication counts. You might want to double-check her work." Twice. The residents exchanged glances, the kind of glance that plants seeds. Sarah's hand didn't shake as she reached for the coffee pot, but she felt the shift in the room's temperature the way a bird feels a change in air pressure before a storm. The pot hissed as she poured. Behind her, the residents moved away from the sink, suddenly very interested in the bulletin board. She sat at her usual table with her lunch. 3 nurses who had sat with her every shift for the past month stood simultaneously, their chairs scraping against the tile floor like fingernails on concrete. They didn't look at her. They didn't acknowledge her. They simply left, carrying their trays to the far corner of the room as if contamination were contagious. Sarah opened her container of grilled chicken and rice. She ate. Her expression remained as still as a stone in still water. By day 3, the isolation was complete. Mercer had done his work well. He moved through the hospital with the precision of a surgeon, but instead of healing, he was excising. In the supply room, Sarah overheard 2 nurses discussing the latest piece of gossip he'd planted. She'd nearly missed a medication count 3 weeks ago. Not true, she'd found the discrepancy herself and reported it, but the truth mattered less than the narrative now. The narrative was that Sarah Chen was reckless. Careless. Someone whose instincts couldn't be trusted. Someone whose presence made you vulnerable. It was the oldest weapon in any institutional arsenal, not a direct attack, but a spreading doubt, a social quarantine implemented through whisper and implication. Mercer worked the room the way a conductor works an orchestra, each gesture calculated for maximum effect. During rounds, he referenced her name in contexts designed to plant questions. Some people think rules are suggestions, that their personal medical judgment trumps protocol. In my experience, that's when patients die. He delivered the line to a group of interns, his voice heavy with manufactured concern, his eyes not quite looking at Sarah but close enough that everyone knew exactly whom he meant. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group like waves. No one defended her. No one asked for specifics. The doubt was the point. The doubt was the weapon. Sarah's composure held like reinforced steel. Her face remained stone, her movements precise and professional. Only her fingers betrayed anything, white-knuckled around her pen during documentation, the pressure so intense that the pen's barrel made a small cracking sound. She wrote her notes with clinical detachment while her hand screamed silently. The public humiliation came on a Wednesday evening during the arrival of a 34-year-old motorcyclist, stable vital signs but mechanism of injury suggesting something beneath the surface. High-speed impact into a guardrail. Chest wall trauma. The kind of injury that could hide damage in plain sight if you weren't looking carefully enough. Sarah suggested a chest X-ray based on what she'd seen, what her hands remembered doing in field hospitals where missing a pneumothorax meant watching someone collapse in front of their family. It's precautionary, she said quietly to Mercer, who was reviewing the chart. Mechanism of injury warrants imaging. He looked up from the chart, his expression shifting into something theatrical, performative. Nurse Chen, he said loudly enough that the waiting area could hear him, I appreciate your enthusiasm. I really do. But diagnostic imaging requires a medical degree. Decisions about imaging protocols are above your scope of practice. Stick to your lane, Two interns laughed nervously. The patient's wife frowned, a small crease appearing between her eyebrows, the look of someone suddenly doubting the person who'd been taking care of her husband. Sarah's jaw clenched. Once. Barely perceptible. Then she turned back to her charting, documenting her recommendation, documenting Mercer's refusal, her handwriting slightly tighter than usual, the letters pressed harder into the paper. It was her voice in writing. It was insurance. It was the only kind of power she could afford. That night in the supply closet, surrounded by boxes of gauze and for tubing and the chemical smell of antiseptic, Sarah allowed herself exactly 60 seconds. She pulled the folded flag from the bottom of her locker, the one from Garcia's casket, the one she had no right to possess, the one she would never recover from having. She gripped it with both hands and let them shake. Just 60 seconds. That was the rule. That was the boundary between surviving and breaking. When the seconds elapsed, she straightened her shoulders, returned the flag to its place, and stepped back into the fluorescent-lit hallway, her face composed, her eyes forward. The next morning, the motorcyclist was readmitted through the emergency department. Delayed tension pneumothorax. His oxygen saturation had dropped overnight, his breathing increasingly labored, the telltale signs of air trapped in his chest cavity compressing his lungs. He'd been stable when Mercer discharged him. He was critical now because Mercer had dismissed Sarah's suggestion without a second thought. The attending physician, Dr. Patterson, a woman who'd been at Cedar Creek for 16 years and had learned to recognize patterns, ordered emergency imaging, called for a needle decompression, and saved the man's life. During the debrief, Mercer blamed the overnight physician for missing the signs. Sarah said nothing. She charted her initial observation, her recommendation, and Mercer's documented refusal. She let the hospital's own record speak. But something had shifted in the room that morning, a subtle recalibration of trust. The veteran nurses, the ones who'd been watching Sarah work for 6 months, began paying closer attention to what happened when Mercer made decisions. They began noticing the gaps between his diagnoses and reality. They began watching more carefully. And they began watching her differently too, not with the fear of association that Mercer had weaponized, but with something closer to respect. Sarah was 3 weeks into the silent campaign when it happened. 3 weeks of sitting alone at lunch. 3 weeks of nurses turning their backs in the hallway. 3 weeks of carefully maintained composure while something cold and certain hardened in her chest, not anger but clarity, not despair but readiness. The kind of clarity that comes when you've already survived the worst and realize that everything that follows is simply practice. She was restocking the medication cart, a task designed to keep her isolated, away from the main team, invisible, when her phone buzzed. Not her personal phone. The hospital phone. A call to the ER from Raleigh-Durham International. A Sikorsky UH-60M Black Hawk was inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Patient in critical condition with cardiac compromise. High-priority transport. The call came from a flight nurse whose voice carried a weight that meant something above the usual medical emergency was in motion. Sarah ended the call and walked back to the station. Around her, the ER shifted into pre-arrival protocol. Beds were prepared. Equipment was staged. Dr. Mercer stood in the trauma bay, unaware that the passenger on that helicopter was exactly the kind of moment that changes everything, the exact kind of moment that separates the people who freeze from the people who move. And that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to being the worst part. The ambulance doors burst open at 11:36 p.m. on a Thursday, and everything Sarah had spent 5 years building came down to 42 seconds of crushing chest pain. The paramedics wheeled Commander James Reeves through Cedar Creek Medical's trauma entrance, his massive frame dwarfed by the stretcher beneath him, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath. 53 years old. Former SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Chest pain radiating down his left arm. Saturation dropping. The kind of cardiac emergency that kills men who've survived worse things in places the Pentagon still wouldn't name. His wife Michelle followed, one hand pressed to her mouth, their 12-year-old daughter Emma. No, not Emma, different name, different girl. Sarah's mind registered the difference and locked it away, trailing behind with the confusion only children understand when the world suddenly stops making sense. Dr. Mercer was already positioned at the trauma bay entrance, clipboard in hand, white coat crisp as fresh authority. He saw the incoming SEAL and smiled the smile of a man who believed credentials and protocol separated him from people like Sarah Chen. He didn't know that the woman about to walk past him had performed emergency cricothyrotomy in a dusty compound outside Tikrit while rounds snapped overhead. He didn't know that hands that looked like any other nurse's hands had performed needle decompression under IED blast conditions. He didn't know anything at all. The commander's saturation was 89 and dropping. 86. The monitor's rhythm looked like a man's heart was trying to claw its way out of his chest. The ER nurses moved with the choreography of controlled crisis, fours going in, leads being placed, the ventilator being prepared for what everyone understood was coming. Sarah was 2 rooms away when her radio crackled. She didn't hesitate. She moved toward the sound like someone answering a call that had been waiting for her for 5 years. The commander's lips were already bluish. His eyes rolled back. His body convulsed once, the kind of movement that meant his heart was giving up the argument. The monitor flatlined with the finality of a closing door. Code blue. Trauma Bay 3. Mercer was calling for the crash cart, his voice clinical and measured, the performance of a man who believed himself in control. We'll establish airway once we've got for access. Standard protocol. Move. But the commander wasn't responding to standard protocol. His oxygen was 68% and his pupils were blown wide. The ER attending was 14 minutes away. Sarah heard the radio call come through, traffic en route for 40, accident blocking both lanes. 14 minutes was an eternity. 14 minutes was death walking at a funeral pace. The newer nurse, the Jessica, fresh out of nursing school 6 months ago, was performing chest compressions with the desperation of someone who believed the textbook might still save him. But the textbook was written by people who'd never watched a man die because everyone waited for protocol. Mercer was still talking, still invoking Hospital Section 7.3.2, still performing competence like it was a script. Sarah could hear him. She heard everything. She heard the monitor's flat line. She heard Michelle's gasp from the observation window. She heard the sound of a daughter understanding, in the way children do, that her father was leaving. She moved. Her hands went to the crash cart without permission. Without announcement. Her fingers found the endotracheal tube, a size 4.0, smooth and curved like a tool she'd held 1,000 times before. Her motions had the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, done it under fire, done it while everything was falling apart. "I've got this," she said quietly. Not a request. Not asking for consensus. Mercer's voice snapped like a whip. "Nurse, step back. That's outside your scope of practice. Standard protocol requires physician supervision for airway management." But Sarah was already positioning the laryngoscope. The commander's mouth opened under the pressure of her left hand, the technique called a jaw thrust that meant she could see the vocal cords without breaking the cervical spine. The light illuminated the back of his throat. There. The opening. The gateway. The tube went in smooth as a prayer. The world didn't slow down. Everything moved exactly as fast as it was supposed to move when someone knew what they were doing. She secured it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd learned this skill in places where the alternative was watching people die while bureaucrats checked forms. The bag valve mask connected. Jessica, understanding what was happening without being told, began squeezing oxygen into the commander's lungs with the rhythm of someone finally following orders that made sense. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. The monitor's rhythm shifted. A blip. Then another. The flat line fragmenting into something that looked almost like a heartbeat. "He's got a pulse," Jessica breathed. The commander's oxygen saturation climbed. 72%. 80%. 94%. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical breath, and Sarah's hands were already pulling the laryngoscope away, already stepping back, already becoming invisible again. But the commander's eyes tracked her movement. Even with drugs coursing through his system, even with his consciousness fractured between death and the electric shock of return, his eyes followed her with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what had just happened. Former combat medic. Someone who'd learned medicine in the same terrible school. Someone who knew the difference between a nurse and a warrior. Michelle's daughter was crying now, but differently, the kind of crying that meant her father was still alive. Mercer's smile was made of ice and calculation. He waited exactly 45 seconds before pulling out his phone. Sarah watched him photograph the trauma bay, the endotracheal tube in place, her hands as they stepped away. She watched him take screenshots of the monitor, of the 4 lines, of the scene as though documentation could transform mercy into violation. His voice, when he spoke, dripped with theatrical concern. "I need to formally document this incident. This patient was subjected to an unauthorized intubation procedure by nursing staff." He said it loud enough for Michelle to hear through the window. Loud enough for the newer nurses to understand what side of history they should be on. Immediate notification to the attending physician. Hospital Policy Section 7.3.2 is explicit. Only licensed physicians perform invasive airway management. This is a patient safety issue. The room went quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical breath. Sarah didn't respond. Didn't defend herself. Didn't explain that the commander would be dead in 14 minutes if anyone had waited for protocol. She simply finished documenting vital signs. Finished recording the timeline. Finished performing the role of a nurse who'd overstepped her boundaries instead of a woman who'd just chosen saving a man's life over bureaucracy. But the commander saw it. His wife saw it. And somewhere in his drug-hazed consciousness, a Navy SEAL was making a note of a woman whose hands moved like someone who'd been trained in places where hesitation meant caskets. The rest of the night moved in the strange syntax of hospital aftermath. The attending arrived. Reviewed the work. Said nothing to Mercer's face about the fact that the commander would have been a code death on his watch if anyone had actually followed protocol. The attending understood the difference between a regulation and reality. But understanding and supporting were 2 different things, especially when Dr. Mercer represented the kind of institutional power that made careers uncomfortable. By 2:14 a.m., the commander was stable in the ICU. Sarah finished her charts in the break room, her movements economical and complete. She didn't sit. Didn't accept the coffee that Jessica offered with eyes full of questions. Didn't speak about what had happened because speaking about it meant acknowledging it, and acknowledging it meant admitting that everything she'd built, the invisibility, the anonymity, the 5-year fortress of being nobody remarkable, had just cracked open in front of witnesses. At 4:37 a.m., during inventory in the supply closet, Sarah allowed herself exactly 60 seconds. The closet was small, lined with boxes of gloves and sterile fields and the mundane machinery of keeping people alive. She locked the door. The fluorescent light hummed its overhead song. And she reached into her locker, the one she thought no one watched, and pulled out the folded flag. It was small, the kind of flag they'd given her at a funeral she couldn't attend because that funeral didn't officially exist. Her teammate. Her partner. The woman who died in a compound outside Tikrit because Sarah had made a call that fractured split seconds the wrong way. Her hand shook. Not from fear. Not from the adrenaline of what she'd done in the trauma bay. But from the weight of 5 years of silence suddenly meeting the moment she'd had to become exactly what she'd been hiding. Hands steady as surgical lasers in front of the commander. Hands shaking now because a man had seen her. Had recognized her. Had understood that she was something other than the sum of her title and her credentials. 48 seconds in, the trembling crested, not fear, but restraint finally breaking like a dam that had held back an entire ocean of sacrifice. 49 seconds. 50. The fold of the flag was soft with handling, worn at the creases from 1,000 nights of this same ritual, the 60 seconds alone where she was allowed to remember that under the scrubs and the quiet and the perfect professional distance, there was a woman who'd seen the worst and still showed up. 58 seconds. 59. At 60, she folded the flag again and placed it back in the locker. Her hand steadied. Her breathing regulated. The nurse returned. The soldier receded back into the spaces where no one could see her. By 7:48 a.m., when she clocked out, the message was already in the hospital system. A formal incident report filed by Dr. Mercer. A notation in her employment record. The beginning of the documentation that would become her undoing, not because she'd saved a life, but because she'd done it in a way that reminded everyone who paid attention that competence without credentials was a threat. She didn't know yet that this day, this moment, had been watched by a Navy SEAL who understood exactly what he'd witnessed. She didn't know that the threads she'd thought were so carefully hidden were about to unravel in ways that would bring the entire Pentagon down on Cedar Creek Medical like judgment. She didn't know that she had less than 14 days before everything changed. But as Sarah drove home through the pre-dawn Raleigh streets, the morning air cool through her cracked window, she felt something shift. A door opening. A weight lifting. The moment when hiding became harder than being seen. What happened next would change everything. 2 weeks stretched across Cedar Creek Medical like scar tissue, Sarah moving through shifts with the same mechanical precision, the same invisible armor. The folded flag stayed in her locker. The termination letter wasn't written yet, but Dr. Mercer had already begun drafting it in the silent architecture of his mind. Commander James Reeves's recovery was methodical. Stable vitals. Color returning to his face. His wife Michelle brought their daughter to visits, the child pressing small hands against the bed rail. The commander watched Sarah when she thought he wasn't looking, that surgical precision, the way she moved like someone who'd done this in conditions that would break ordinary people. He was a former combat medic himself. He recognized the signature. Tuesday afternoon, 3:02 p.m. The code alarm shrieked across the ER like a banshee. Trauma Bay 3. Pneumothorax. Dropping fast. Sarah was restocking supplies when she heard it. She moved toward the sound without thinking, muscle memory that transcended protocol. The trauma bay erupted in controlled chaos, nurses calling out vitals, an attending physician barking orders, the ventilator already positioned. But it wasn't trauma that brought her there. It was the bed number. The face. Commander Reeves was seizing. Gasping. His oxygen saturation numbers cascaded across the monitor like a death countdown, 88. 82, 76. The attending, not Mercer, thank God, was ordering chest imaging, talking about waiting for confirmation. But Sarah's eyes saw what the monitor confirmed, tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung wasn't just a problem. It was a ticking clock wrapped in flesh and bone. Pressure was compressing his heart. His lungs. Every second he didn't breathe was a second closer to cardiac arrest. Needle decompression. Now, Sarah said quietly. The attending turned. We're waiting for the attending surgeon. He'll be dead in 90 seconds. Not a question. A statement of physics. Sarah's hands were already moving. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. This was her domain, not the sterile fluorescence of the hospital. Not protocol and credentials and chains of command. This was the forward operating base. This was the choice between procedure and survival. The needle went in. The hiss that followed, that distinctive metallic release of pressure, was louder than the ventilator, louder than the monitor, louder than the attending's shocked intake of breath. Air escaping. The pneumothorax decompressing. The commander's oxygen saturation climbed like a miracle climbing a wall. 72. 78, 85. 92, 94. Stable. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway exactly as the numbers stabilized. His face rearranged itself like a photograph being developed in reverse, the red flush, the jaw tightening, the eyes narrowing into slits of pure administrative fury. He watched Sarah secure the needle, her movements economical, her face utterly serene. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge him. She finished her work and stepped back, allowing the attending to take position. Oxygen saturation is stable, Sarah said to no one in particular. Breath sounds bilateral. His breathing. Mercer's voice, when it came, was a knife wrapped in velvet. Interesting that you performed a physician-level intervention without physician authorization. Again. Sarah glanced at him once. Then returned to her work. The commander's eyes tracked her movements with that look again, the recognition of someone who'd seen training like this only in combat zones. The next morning, Sarah found the incident report on the break room bulletin board. 17 pages. Typed in justified margins. Footnoted. Cross-referenced with hospital policy sections for .2.3 through 7.9.1 about scope of practice, chain of command protocols, unauthorized clinical decisions, failure to defer to physician authority. Mercer had documented everything, not just this intervention, but a pattern. A constellation of violations he'd been building for weeks. The medication error he'd witnessed, which had been his error, actually, but the documentation said differently. The time she'd suggested a different antibiotic protocol, which had been correct, but the report called it presumptive. Each one individually dismissible. Together they formed a narrative of recklessness. Of a nurse practicing medicine without a license. The complaint had already gone to the state nursing board. The 17 pages ended with a single sentence: patient safety must remain our primary concern. This employee represents a persistent threat to institutional standards. Sarah read it once. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. Her jaw clenched, a single visible thread of restraint stretched too far, but nothing else moved. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She poured her coffee as if the document didn't exist and moved on to her shift. But she knew. The knowing was a weight in her chest, heavy as depleted uranium. HR called her into the office at 1:15 p.m. the following day. Tuesday. The sun was streaking through the hospital windows, hitting the linoleum at that particular angle that made everything look either transcendent or doomed. Sarah walked into the office with the same composure she'd walked into Tikrit, spine straight, hand steady, mind already 3 moves ahead. The security guard was standing by the door. "We're placing you on immediate suspension pending a full board review," the HR director said. She wasn't unkind, exactly. Just thoroughly complicit. "Your nursing license has been flagged. You'll need to retain an attorney." The termination notice was printed on institutional letterhead. Sarah read it without emotion registering on her face, though something deep in her chest was fracturing like ice under spring thaw. "You're entitled to an exit interview, but we'll need to secure your badge and escort you from the building." She went to her locker in the break room. Muscle memory. Just like everything else. She removed her personal items slowly, methodically, the way she'd removed equipment from field hospitals under fire. There wasn't much. A photo of Emma. A change of scrubs. And in the back corner, wrapped in plastic, the folded flag from her last deployment, from Marcus, from the firefight outside Tikrit, from the moment everything changed. She tucked it under her arm. The security guard walked her to her car. Other nurses watched from the hallway. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody asked questions. The rumor mill had already written the story. Sarah Chen was unstable. Sarah Chen had crossed a line. Sarah Chen wasn't a team player. She drove home at 2:07 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the windows down, the North Carolina heat pressing against her like a living thing. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10:02, the way she'd been taught. Breathing steady. Heart rate controlled. Just like every other extraction from a failed operation. Emma's school bus had come early. Her daughter was standing in the driveway when Sarah pulled in, backpack slung over one shoulder, confusion flickering across her face like a question mark made flesh. "Mommy? Why's your car home? Are you sick?" "Just a slow day, babe. Come inside." The apartment was exactly as they'd left it that morning. 2 bowls in the sink from Emma's cereal. The toy chest in the corner of the living room. The small routine of their small life together. Sarah had chosen this. Chosen to disappear into ordinary. Chosen to be just a mom, just a nurse, just someone unremarkable enough that nobody would look too closely. That night, after Emma had finished her homework and watched 30 minutes of television before bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with the termination letter. She read it again. Then again. The words didn't change. The reality didn't reshape itself into something more survivable. She was fired. She was poison in the medical community now. Her nursing license was under investigation. There would be hearings. There would be lawyers. There would be costs she couldn't absorb. She opened the laptop to search for jobs, but her hands hovered over the keyboard like they belonged to someone else. At 4:13 p.m., Emma found her there. The child had come downstairs for water, had seen the kitchen lights still on, had wandered in with that particular gravity children have when they sense something has shifted in the adult world. She stopped in the doorway, and Sarah felt her daughter's eyes register the scene, Mommy at the table. Papers spread. Mommy's shoulders shaking once, twice, silent tears cutting tracks through her composure like rivers through concrete. Mommy. Emma's voice was very small. Why are you crying? Why are you home? Sarah closed her eyes. She had answers for everything else. Medical crises, combat scenarios, impossible choices that required split-second decisions. But this required honesty, and honesty would break the entire architecture of their lives. I had a bad day at work, sweetheart. The lie felt like swallowing broken glass. A really bad day. Emma padded across the kitchen, still in her school clothes, and climbed into Sarah's lap the way she still did sometimes, even though she was growing too big for it. She tucked her head under Sarah's chin, and Sarah held her, breathing in the scent of her daughter's apple-scented shampoo, feeling the small weight of her against her chest. It's okay, Mommy. You can have a bad day. You're still the best Mommy. The words nearly destroyed her. Sarah held on tighter, feeling 5 years of survival, 5 years of hiding, 5 years of pretending to be someone smaller than she was all pressing against the inside of her ribs like they were trying to escape. She had no idea what was about to walk through the doors of Cedar Creek Medical. She had no idea that Commander Reeves had spent the last 24 hours on a secure phone line. She had no idea that a 2-star general in Washington had looked at a junior SEAL's recommendation and recognized something in those combat techniques, had checked classified databases, had made calls that went beyond standard military channels, had begun the machinery of revelation that would either destroy everything or save it. All she knew, holding her daughter in the darkness of the kitchen, was that she'd tried to be someone she wasn't, and it hadn't been enough. The folded flag sat on the table next to the termination letter, 2 pieces of her past, demanding acknowledgement. Outside, the North Carolina night pressed against the windows, patient and absolute. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors began their slow rotation, a sound Sarah's body recognized before her mind could process it. The helicopter rotors stopped. 24 hours had passed since Sarah's badge was cut from her lanyard, since security escorted her through the ER doors for the last time, since Emma asked why Mommy was crying at the kitchen table. 24 hours since the world went perfectly, impossibly silent. It started with the sound before anything else. Boots on linoleum, 2 sets, synchronized, hitting the floor like rifle reports. Not the shuffle of doctors. Not the tired drag of nurses finishing double shifts. These were dress blues. Polished shoes. The kind of footfall that made the break room conversation stop mid-sentence. Sarah was in the supply closet, reorganizing inventory she no longer had authority to touch, when she heard the PA crackle, "Dr. Mercer, please report to the main entrance." Her hand stilled on a box of 18-gauge needles. The voice was administrative. Formal. The way they called people when lawyers were involved. But the boots kept walking past the supply room door. Past the nurse's station. Straight through the ER toward room for 12. Commander James Reeves' room. Sarah's eyes locked on the folded flag she kept tucked in the back corner of the supply shelf, partially hidden behind spare trauma shears. The flag of her teammate. The flag she touched at 2 a.m. when the weight of breathing felt too heavy. She left it there and moved toward the hallway. The 2 Marines were impossible to miss. Tall. Immaculate. Their dress blues pressed into sharp lines, insignia gleaming under fluorescent light like polished steel. They stood on either side of the doorway to room for 12 with the casual authority of men used to being obeyed. One was a gunnery sergeant. The other, a captain with a scar running from his right temple to his jaw like a warning. And between them, walking through the hallway she'd once commanded, was Sarah. She moved toward them the way she always moved, efficient, composed, unremarkable. A nurse going to check on a patient. Except her jaw had tightened once, imperceptibly, and her breathing had shifted into the rhythm she'd learned in Fallujah when the world was about to splinter open. Dr. Mercer was already at the door, his face the color of hospital drywall. His hands were shaking. "What is this?" His voice came out high-pitched. "Defensive. This is highly irregular. I need to know the authority for." "Step aside, Doctor," the scarred captain said. It wasn't a request. It was a command rendered in the flat, lethal politeness of men who were used to being obeyed the first time. Mercer stepped aside. The Marines flanked Sarah as she entered the room. Commander Reeves was sitting up straighter than he had any right to, color returning to a face that had been the color of ash 72 hours ago. The vent was gone. His chest moved with his own breath. But it was the man in the next bed who went rigid. He was thin, skeletal, really, with scars running up both arms like maps of a war nobody wanted to talk about. His eyes tracked Sarah the moment she crossed the threshold, and something in his scarred face transformed. Recognition. The kind that comes from having seen someone's face across rifle sights and lived to carry the memory. His lips moved. When the words came, they were in Dari, then English, his accent thick with the dust of places that didn't exist on official maps. Al-Malak, the angel. The room went absolutely still. Sarah didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She turned to the scarred man, really looked at him, and saw it all at once. The firefight outside Tikrit. The explosion that had collapsed the market. The man who had been running toward civilians, who she had pulled back from the rubble, whose hands had helped her carry out 3 children and an elderly woman. A man on the wrong side of the war who had chosen right when it mattered. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Held it there. Said nothing. Sometimes the loudest communication is the sound of someone finally being seen. The senior Marine, gunnery sergeant with ribbons that spoke of deployments to places that still didn't have stable electricity, opened a folder. His voice was parade ground precise, Captain Sarah Chen. Navy Cross for Valor during Operation Phantom Dagger. 7 combat deployments, Helmand Province, Loga, Tikrit AO. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat Medic Certification with Advanced Surgical Protocols. Medical Discharge, 2019. Subsequent civilian nursing licensure, Cedar Creek Medical, Raleigh, North Carolina. Each sentence was a button being pushed, and with each one, Dr. Mercer's face drained further of color. That's impossible, Mercer's voice cracked like breaking glass. She's just a what? The voice came from the doorway. A two-star general stood in the threshold. His uniform was immaculate, the kind of immaculate that comes from command, not decoration. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, and when he looked at the ribbons and medals the Marines were now holding, something shifted in the room's air pressure itself. He rendered a salute. Not a casual acknowledgement. A full parade ground salute, arm bent at exactly 90 degrees, executed with the kind of precision that made the message clear: you are seeing someone of consequence. You will treat her accordingly. Every doctor in the hallway snapped to attention. Dr. Mercer's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His hands, which had trembled all morning, now hung useless at his sides. The general approached Sarah directly. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that commands rooms without raising volume. Captain Chen, the vice president, wanted to be here personally, but duties prevented it. His nephew survived because of your intervention. Your commitment to the oath. Your refusal to accept protocol over human life. He handed her an envelope. Presidential seal. Heavy cream cardstock. The kind of invitation that changes trajectories and opens doors that normal human beings never even know exist. You're invited to the White House ceremony, the general said. 6 weeks. Medal of Freedom. The president herself wants to recognize your service. Mercer made a sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Then the general's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something hardened behind his eyes. He turned to Dr. Mercer. Doctor, I suggest you check your email. Your institution is about to become very interested in your employment practices. Mercer's phone was already buzzing. His colleague in the break room had filmed it. Everything. 3 weeks ago. The stage whispered comments. The cruel nicknames, just a nurse, thinks she's military, probably bought her qualifications on some internet site. The way he'd smiled when she walked in and nurses stood to leave. All of it. Gone viral. Hashtags forming. Comments stacking like artillery fire. Doctor bullies his co-worker for years, finds out she's Navy Cross recipient. Play stupid games. And the phone rings again. His medical school mentor, Dr. Patricia Valdez. The legendary trauma surgeon who had championed his career at Harvard. Her voice came through the speaker before he could even greet her. I watched that video, Michael. I watched you ridicule and systematize the exclusion of a woman with more combat medical experience than both of us combined. I no longer recognize you as my student. You will be receiving a formal letter withdrawing my recommendation. The hospital board will also be receiving my assessment that your documentation practices warrant immediate investigation. She hung up. Mercer tried to move, but the Marines hadn't moved. They were simply present. The kind of present that makes running impossible. He walked, instead, toward his office, his phone already lighting up with calls from the hospital board. The meeting took 90 minutes. By minute 45, they had pulled every incident report he'd filed on Sarah and found the holes. No supporting documentation. Pharmacy records that contradicted his timeline of medication errors. Cross-reference notes that showed dates he'd marked her as negligent on shifts she'd actually worked with perfect charts. Then they went further back. 15 other incident reports over 3 years. A pattern of targeting staff who made him feel inadequate. A systematic documentation trail designed to destroy people. 1 physician assistant. 2 nurses. Another nurse. Another. All competent. All threatening to his sense of superiority. The investigation was launched before Mercer left the room. His medical license was suspended pending state board review by 1847 hours. By 1900, the hospital's CEO was calling Sarah, offering reinstatement with full back pay, formal written apology, a promotion to ER clinical director, and a request that she consider staying. Sarah's voice remained calm, the composure of someone who had already made other plans. "I'm honored, but I have other commitments. There's someone at the White House who wants to see me receive a medal first." The CEO understood. The tone of her voice was someone who had stopped being a nurse and started being something vastly larger. By 2100, Mercer was clearing out his office, escorted by the same security guard who had removed Sarah 5 days earlier. His desk pictures, his Harvard diploma, his engagement photo, his skiing trip to Aspen, all went into a box. The corner office, suddenly empty, made the irony tangible enough to touch. His wife served him with divorce papers that night. She'd seen the video too. His colleagues stopped returning calls. Medical communities are small, and viral videos have the persistence of scars. One call from Dr. Valdez through her network was enough. Mercer had become the embodiment of institutional cruelty exposed. No one wanted to associate with him. The hiss of the elevator doors closing on his last day at Cedar Creek Medical sounded like air escaping from a balloon, slow, final, irreversible. If you found Sarah's story as gripping as I did, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? I'd love to hear your stories of quiet strength triumphing over arrogance. Thank you for watching.